Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Sung-Sugden, and I'm the COO of the Global Alliance of Impact Lawyers, better known as GALE. We're extremely excited to be a part of this year's Sustainable Contract Day. For those of you who are new to GALE, we're a global community of impact lawyers working to use the law as a force for good for people and the planet. Our network spans 6 regions: Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, North America, and the UK. We bring together expertise of impact lawyers from across the world to share insights on how law can drive sustainable business and shift capital for positive impact. I'm especially excited for the session you're about to watch, where you hear insights from our incredible panel on how contracts can evolve from being tools of compliance to powerful levers for positive change. I want to give a big thank you to our GALE members, David Friedlinger and Sarah Ellington, for taking the time to share their thoughts and experiences with us. If you like what you hear during the session and want to stay updated on future GALE events and news, please head over to our website, galenet.org. Now over to you, David and Sarah.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all, even though I don't see you since this is a recording. So my name is, as Karen said, David Friedlinger. I'm a Swedish attorney at a law firm called Serial Law Firm. I'm also a GALE member, of course, and also sit on the European board. There's a regional board in Europe for GALE. I'm a contracting expert and will share some knowledge today. I'm also written some books about that, and also expert and written some books about EU sustainability law. So that's briefly about me. Who are you, Sarah?
Hi, thanks, David. So I am the chair of the UK Regional Board for GALE. I'm a dispute resolution, ESG and impact partner at Watson, Farley and Williams, based in our London office. And also wear several other hats, including as a lead co-creator at the Legal Innovation for Sustainable Investments Foundation, or LISI for short. And we'll hear a bit more about some of the projects we've done with LISI, I think, as we go through.
Yeah. And we, for those of you who listen here, we won't share any slides. We have structured this as more of a conversation between Sarah and myself. And we will speak about, since this is a World CC conference and we are also representing GALE, we will try to combine this to talk about impacts in contracting and in contracts. And I mean, in both in how can you avoid negative impact, or how is it easy to actually create negative impact in contracts, but also how can you protect and promote positive impacts through contracts. And this can be explored across a number of or various areas of contracting. Isn't that right, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've tried to choose a couple of what we think are really interesting ones. And so we're going to look at this through the lens of, in first instance, social outcomes contracts, impact investment transactions, and hopefully, if we have time, maybe some other types of contracts such as offtake agreements, manufacturing contracts as well. Yeah. So David, let's get started. Let's start with social outcomes contracts. There may be some people in the audience who haven't come across these before. So can you start off by describing what social outcomes contracts are?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that in a second. I just think that we should remind everyone. Now we choose these contracts just to show that the impact can be imported across a number of different contracts. If you're not working with this or that specific contract, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we think that you will find it highly valuable anyhow. Okay, so social outcomes contract, that's really sort of an impact contract. That is a contract where it's sort of exists in 2 ways, but one way is it's a finance contract where you have a lender who lends money typically to some public sector entity like a municipality, or it can be a supplier contract, also a supplier providing services to a municipality or the government. But the key is the purpose of the contract is to generate positive social outcomes, and that can be to deal with criminality, youth criminality, or elderly care, etc. And so you have social outcomes that you want to improve, and the secret is that the lender is repaid or the supplier is paid only if the outcomes are achieved. So it's really sort of aligning the interests in achieving the outcomes. That's a short story about the social outcomes contract.
Yeah, so these are real impact specific contracts. So people might not have come across them before. Are they commonly used in your experience?
Well, I think they are spreading. I know that they are quite common where you come from in United Kingdom, quite popular there, and they're spreading. I'm working in Sweden with some clients in that area now. And I know, I mean, there are these social outcomes bonds, for example, also. That's another example of this. So growing, and I think many see, not least from the financial perspective, advantages because often the public sector maybe lack the financial resources, etc. And this is a great way to bring in private money to generate impact.
Great. So hopefully we'll see more of them in the future.
Mm.
But obviously, whenever you have a more innovative contractual structure, sometimes they've got a couple of challenges, both in terms of how you draft them and then how they get impacted. Would you say there's one key challenge or a couple of key challenges from the kind of contract lawyer's perspective?
Yes. I think that, I mean, a traditional contract lawyer would hate this kind of contracts. Because, I mean, if we take on that hat, we want predictability, we want to know what's going to happen, and we can plan in a good way what to achieve, so we can sort of nail that in the contract. And more so, I mean, depending on where you're from, maybe a bit less if you're from Scandinavia, but quite a lot if you're from the United Kingdom, maybe. But typically you would want to know. In this case, this is not really possible, because you can have a great idea about the outcome. Now I want fewer youth, more youth managing better in school or being able to read, or I want to have fewer elderly people entering into sort of the elderly care, etc. And you can have great hypotheses on how to achieve that, but you can never know. You must have flexibility, and this is a real challenge that you have to manage here. So that I would say that is a key challenge. And as I said, typically a traditional contracting lawyer would hate this, I would say.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that then puts a lot of risk on the supplier, because I suppose there could be circumstances where they do everything right, they do everything that they plan to, but the outcome just doesn't happen. And then also kind of risks to the lender in terms of, if it doesn't happen, are you going to get repaid? How do you deal with that as a contract lawyer?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, typically sort of financing contract, if you talk to my banking and finance department, then you would have those sort of strict covenants, etc. Make sure, I mean, and really sort of prescribe in detail what's going to do, and the same in a supply contract. And often the suppliers here I mean, they can be NGOs or non-profit companies with not sort of strong balance sheets. So this may impose a huge risk for them. But on the other hand, if you don't take that risk, if you don't deal with that, then there is no contract. So there's this inherent tension here. What I have started to do, and I know that this has been looked upon also in the UK, is I mean, one area where I work a lot, and you know this, Sarah, is what we call relational contracts, which is sort of a different kind of contract, where it's a written contract and legally binding and everything, but where you really want to focus a lot on how to promote a long-term partnership between the parties, and not just let that be sort of, let's hope that the parties like each other and there's a good chemistry, etc. But really to formally structure the parties' relationship, to have common goals, which in this case is the outcomes. Of course, have some clear what's called guiding principles regarding equity and loyalty, etc., and really sort of robust governance structure to manage that relationship. And this is, I have used this sort of in other kind of, sort of where you have outcome-based economics, like in outsourcing, etc. And this is the way, one way to deal with this tension also in social outcomes contract, and it has turned out to work really well. So it's much sort of fairer kind of contract, which also resonates very well with typically the actors in this sector, maybe not sort of the hardcore commercial players, right? Yeah, so that's one way of dealing with it.
So, I mean, obviously, relational contracting, we've worked on some things on this together before. It's a really interesting area. One that, you know, as you've kind of mentioned already, might be kind of come across as an anathema to a normal contracts lawyer, a traditional contracts lawyer, because essentially you have to then have a bit of flexibility, I suppose, built in, rather than everything kind of being spelt out. But I suppose in a way that can work quite well for something like a social outcomes contract, where you need that flexibility if unexpected things happen.
Yes. And it's a good question. So we can sort of broaden this discussion and circle back to this with the outcomes contract. But then, of course, I can ask you, in what contract don't you need the flexibility, right? You do need that. You need to adapt. But we have this often this traditional contracting lawyer hat on, because then if you have flexibility, that means it can be vague. It can be abused. The flexibility can be abused between the parties, etc. And then the typical remedy is to have even further clauses, but then what you lose, of course, is the flexibility. So you lose out of it, and this is, I mean, this is not my invention. It's and it has been researched a lot for many years. That to combine this sort of, you have to deal with it in a kind of strong informal relationship, but then to structure contract to really formally support that. That's a great tool, not only for this kind of contract, but for any. But in particular here, I would say, because there is so much flexibility, because it's so complex. How do you really deal with these young criminals or these diseases or whatever?
Yeah, so it really requires quite a lot of trust between the parties.
Yes, no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously in my practice as a dispute resolution lawyer, we often get involved when you've come to a situation where, because the contract was so specifically drafted, obviously everyone hoped at the time that they had catered for every possible thing that could happen. But the law of the world is that ultimately things are going to happen that you can't have imagined at the time or you didn't work for. And you know, certainly in the English legal system, our case law is developed to try and deal with that. But it does mean that, you know, if you want to go down that risk of trying to be as specific as possible and not having the flexibility, then you might well end up having to spend quite a lot of time in the company of a dispute resolution lawyer. And I promise that we are very nice, but that's not always something that people want to do.
No, and luckily enough, so far I have been working with this for, I don't know, 12, 15 years, and so far none has gone to court, ended up in court. Yeah. So, I mean, that was a bit about social outcomes contract. Let's go to an area where maybe more people will be more familiar, investments, and then in particular, since we're from Gale, impact investments and contracts and how to govern those contracts. So, okay, how would you explain, for those listening here not familiar with impact investments, how would you describe it, Sarah?
I think in really simple terms, it's where an investment is made, and in addition to financial returns, what the parties are seeking are positive social, environmental outcomes. So again, something that has impact essentially inherent within it in terms of the goals of the parties. But I think traditionally and in the past, the legal documentation hasn't always necessarily really reflected those goals. And And that's particularly the case for impact investment, where there's this idea that the impacts that you really want to achieve as a result of this investment being made into a company that's going to, make a real difference on the ground, is in fact that you're going to have impacts on third parties. So it's a particular kind of contracting scenario where you've got the two parties that are the parties to the investment documentation, the investor that's putting the money in, whether that's through equity or debt, and then the project company that's essentially going to carry on its business in this way in order to try and get this change to happen. But in a contractual sense, and certainly lawyers have done a lot over time to try and avoid this happening, the people or nature or the environment that you're actually trying to make the positive impacts for aren't a party to the contract. They're actively excluded from the contract. And so you've got this kind of weird situation where you're trying to achieve something for someone who's then almost actively shut out of things.
I mean, can you give some examples? I mean, I can give some also, but share some examples of impact investment. What could it be?
Yeah, so a lot of impact investment looks at renewable energies, for example. A lot of the impacts are in developing countries, particularly across the African continent. So taking those two themes together, it might be something like, investing in micro solar grid in Africa, with the idea that essentially that will have all sorts of other positive social benefits as well. And that could range from things like, people being able to increase the amount that they earn from their agricultural product because they're able to refrigerate it because they have power, and therefore that it's got a longer shelf life and they can export it over a longer time. It could be that children have access to extra materials or extra time, particularly during the winter months for schoolwork. So, essentially, when you're an impact investor or you're a company looking for impact investment, you will have your theory of change, and that will set out what you hope you will achieve from making the investment or undertaking your projects on the ground.
And to be clear, and I know you agree, this doesn't have to happen in Africa. I mean, for example, in Stockholm, where I act, the Stockholm tech community is now shifting to impact. I mean, the entrepreneurs are shifting to impact, and it's everything from carbon capture stuff, energy related and climate related, but also in the food system. I'm working with a client which is sort of plant-based protein, which is important, and it can be many things and lots of impact investors. But often, of course, it is also third world related.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's very difficult and almost counterproductive, I suppose, to try and give examples because there's so many different ways. But it is really about achieving that additional outcome. So you're not just chasing the money, you're chasing something else for a real.
Yes, and I think we have. I've had discussions whether these scooters like Voi or Bird, those, I don't know how, is that an impact company? I don't see many use taking those instead of taking the car. It's so maybe not, but then there are, so the positive outcome with that is not really built into the business model. But then there are these really impact companies where it's inherent in the business model that I earn money and make profits by generating positive outcomes or positive impacts. So I think that's the way to explain it. But okay, going back to this, in some of these, sometimes there are really sort of third-party beneficiaries, to put it formally, and they are obviously absent. They're not at the negotiation table, etc. You mentioned that's a challenge that can be an issue. What kind of legal structure can be? How can you structure a deal to cater for that or to overcome that issue?
Yeah, so for me, obviously, there's a couple of different things, but probably the primary thing is really thinking about governance structures, and making sure that those governance structures are inclusive as possible. So things like thinking about undertaking due diligence at an early stage and before you enter into your contract documents, identifying the stakeholder, making sure that to the extent possible you can include them in the contract design. Because ultimately, if you're looking to make an impact on the life of a third person, or you're looking to make an impact on nature and biodiversity or climate change, then you really need, in any of those scenarios, the experts on those issues in order to help you design how the impacts can really kind of be supercharged in a way, and be long lasting and sustainable impacts. And sometimes those will be, experts in nature. Sometimes those experts in nature are often drawn from the indigenous communities, because of that really close bond. And sometimes it's as simple as asking the person who, you want to use a cook stove, for example, whether the thing that you're thinking about providing them in order to try and provide a lot of positive impacts, both for the environments and individuals using those types of things themselves, will actually use it, whether there's any barriers to them using it, and just making sure that all of the feedback that you get from that is built into your company operating model, but also the governance around that.
So, and the governance is then you add the governance piece into the contract, right?
Yeah,
And where would
absolutely.
that be? Would that be sort of in a shareholders agreement, or where would you add that?
Yeah, so you'd usually put that into the shareholders agreement. And you might also seek to put extra protections around the terms that you have in your shareholders agreement. Things like, should you have a golden share if you want to change any of the provisions that are specifically geared towards impact, and that those could only happen if the kind of mission guardian that holds that share is happy for that amendment to take place. But absolutely, you'd set out your governance provisions in the shareholders agreement, and that can take a number of different forms. And again, it's around that kind of consultation and design piece, in terms of what really works for the particular scenario you're in. And each contract is really its own beast, so we'll need different things. It could be that it would be sufficient to give stakeholders or a stakeholder representative a board seat, a formal board seat. It could be a requirement that the board has to take into account stakeholder views, maybe from a nominated person or organisation, when they're undertaking relevant board decisions. It could be something like a separate stakeholder board, which then feeds into the board. It could be making sure that you've got great grievance redress mechanisms to make sure that issues can be surfaced and dealt with in a really timely manner. Or it could be things like having reputational consequences. So as an interesting example, people on the call might know the way that the kind of grievance redress mechanism has morphed into a bit of a governance structure within Tony Chocolonely, as a great example, and the fact that the mission guardians don't necessarily have a kind of golden vote or board share, but do have the power to put a double page spread in the Tony Chocolonely publications if the company isn't addressing things as it is supposed to be. So there's a very big number of options. Obviously, they need to be negotiated, and there's lots of other things to go around it. But I think the key thing is really this consultation piece, and building in those views.
And just to sort of, as you said, it's a broad spectrum. Tony Chocolonely, I mean, that's one of the most advanced I've ever heard of, actually. And they have this mission guardian, etc. And I mean, but it's a continuum. I mean, you can start small. So I always find this fascinating also, because then what if there is a tension between the perhaps someone has a more short-term commercial goal than and someone or another shareholder wants, to promote the impact, and how do you deal with that? I mean, Tony Chocolonely have obviously they have catered for that, but that's an interesting sort of new thing for a traditional investment lawyer to think about, because it creates a nice dynamic, really, which is obviously also dealt with partly through this governance mechanism that you.
Yeah, and obviously it depends quite a bit in terms of what the power dynamic is and the negotiating strength of the different investors and the shareholders. Don't forget that obviously most impact companies are kind of founder-led, because they've set up as a passion project of the founder and then need extra investment in order to go forward. So those founders may well already have a shareholding. They might want to put in specific protections. The way in which an impact fund has been set up might require it to have specific protections. And then there's also all of the kind of policies and internal decisions of other impact investors, including those that input into those funds, as to kind of how much protection they want to put around mission.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, I mean, this kind of way of working requires a lot of transparency and also sharing information, etc. That's always a good idea, but not least in this. But that can be quite sensitive also, because many, I don't want to share my trade secrets or something. And how is that dealt with?
Yeah, so I think a lot of these lessons come out of where we were putting together the LISI impact term sheet. And one of the things that we realized quite early on was that in order for these governance structures to work effectively, you really did need relatively high levels of transparency. Because ultimately, if you've got stakeholders that are supposed to be involved in decision making, they're not going to be able to really engage with that or have good ideas or be able to take into account everything that they need to, unless the information about the company and what it's doing is shared with them. And I suppose this kind of has this neat route back to your kind of relational contracting, and the really need for trust between both contractual partners. And I guess in this scenario, those stakeholders that are sitting outside the immediate contract, and making sure that you've really formed that relationship from the start.
Yeah. And those mechanisms, are they working?
So I think that it very much depends on the relationships that have already been built. So I think using something like the relational contracting models that you use, and having that system at the beginning where you sit down and you workshop together and you work out how you're going to deal with each other, does help to kind of build that firm foundation. I think that there's always this worry, perhaps because lawyers have been so jealously guarding confidentiality and been putting all of these confidentiality provisions in for so long, to kind of not want the information to be particularly out there. And so there are, other potential solutions as well. Thinking about, can you make a way of explaining things that's going to work really well for the stakeholders that you're working with, without necessarily giving them reams and reams of documentation? Can you agree on what information that they really need in order to make the decisions, and what information you really need to keep confidential, rather than making it a total blanket thing? And the other thing that we've been exploring is the use of a third-party mediator as well. So Gale, as an organisation, is currently undertaking a series of roundtables in conjunction with the Cairo Centre, looking at detail as how the rules that have been put together by the Cairo Centre can be implemented in infrastructure and extractive projects, to kind of, be able to share information that's necessary with affected communities, and act as that translator, but be able to keep things confidential if it's really necessary as well.
Yeah, this is fun. It's sort of innovation in contracting. Yeah, but I'm a real contract nerd on the other hand, so I think it's fun. I mean, think about contracts, but very much this is about, of course, regardless of what kind of contract you use, to make the parties sort of walk in the same direction or pull in the same direction. It applies for all these contracts we are discussing, of course. But in this kind of an impact investment, how can you contract in this case for sort of avoiding people from pulling in different directions?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One thing is, having this agreement at the outset, not only that the company is there to make money, and how it's going to do that through its business objectives, but also how you're going to measure impact objectives, and making sure that those are really good KPIs that you're measuring. You don't have to have hundreds of them, but you need to have the ones that are really, showing that this is making a difference to people's lives and it's doing that in a positive way. And then once you've got that kind of foundation of the KPIs, then you've got something that everyone can be measured against.
Yeah.
So thinking about making sure that things are fair in terms of if someone's going to get a bonus, different people at different levels of the organization should also be incentivized towards that bonus, all using the same KPIs.
Yeah.
There shouldn't be some kind of fat cat at the top of the organization who is getting paid a lot more than others. So quite commonly use things like ratio caps between the highest and the lowest earners. And just making sure that everything comes back to this kind of shared vision that you've worked on, and really congregates around that.
I have a great story to tell about this. Sorry, but going back to the social outcomes contract, I mean, that's also can be, as I said, on that. But I had a client and the municipality. We had written the social outcomes sort of compensation model, repayment based on a KPI, based on data that was published by the Swedish government every year. So the entire economic model was tied to that piece of data. And all of a sudden it was gone. So the entire foundation for the deal, or it wasn't the foundation, but this critical piece to keep the parties aligned through the KPI was gone. But then I was very happy to hear, because then they have this relational contract and they had this, as you said, the visions and the goals, etc., and those guiding principles with fairness and equity, etc. They sort of force you, and then they had also sat together for months and discussed and were trusting each other. So they really managed to get back on the table and said, okay, so now we have to deal with this. We have to find another KPI, and how do we sort of in a fair way deal with this? And then they had discussed that for like 6 weeks, and then the data came back. So problem solved. But I think it was still also a good story to tell how this really can work when it's the most sort of sensitive thing in the deal, because it was so that KPI that was based for the compensation. Sorry for interrupting. When you said, I just wanted to share this.
No, I think it's a great illustration again of that need for flexibility. And obviously, to some extent, when you're measuring things like KPIs, it is great to have those kind of consistent over time so that you can show the progress. But ultimately, as you kind of develop a product in particular further, things are going to change. So you might need to change that. And it's only if you've got that kind of conversation between the different parties and the stakeholders that you're going to be able to identify if something needs to change. And then
exactly. Yeah. I think many tends to forget that KPIs are just proxies for the goal that you want to achieve. They sort of confuse the KPI with what you really want to achieve. And that's
Yeah. Great. So I think we've probably got a few minutes left to talk about some other types of contracts.
Yeah, sure.
And I was intrigued to hear more about your work on offtake agreements in particular.
Yeah. Okay. And this is also related to these impact areas. And and also it's in renewable energy. This has been quite big for some time, this power purchasing agreement. But there is a specific challenge which I like with this, because the PPAs are quite sort of developed in the market right now. But many of these impact companies here in Stockholm, we have a great sort of SaaS community. Everything has been software as a service, but now they are, as I said, this protein-based, plant-based protein, or they want, have fish farming on land or capture carbon, etc. That requires a lot of investments. But on the other hand, they have but they don't own anything. I mean, they are passion driven, as you say, and so they cannot go to the bank and say, I want to lend money, and because they cannot put anything up for because they don't own any real property, etc. So what you have to do is you have to have an offtake agreement, meaning that you have to go to a customer saying, hey, dear customer, I have this great idea that I want, and then I wanted to buy products of me in the future, and I want you to promise me now to do that later, because if you do that, then I can show to the bank or to some equity funder that I have liquidity revenues coming in, etc. And that is what an offtake agreement is really about. I mean, eventually when you nail it, is that it's an agreement that you enter into for sort of future revenues that you can take to the bank, and then sort of make the business take off. So that's why it is an offtake agreement. So that's
so really potentially very impactful, because
yes.
it allows these innovative designs to get off the ground. But I guess as well, with any contract where you're likely to have some risk that the project might never get off the ground.
Exactly.
Things might not happen how you wanted. The quality of the product might not be what you wanted.
Well,
Sounds
they may not be developed in time. And you may have a customer who I want this. This is sort of, I need to put this in my product development plan, and then you cannot deliver on time. And do you know, as a customer, eventually when the product has been developed, is this the best price in the market? And who's going to carry the risk for cost increases, etc. So one of those contracts that a typical lawyer would hate, which I love. Not that they hate it, but it's I like it when it's hard. So that's so what you deal with is in offtake.
Yeah. Well, so how do you manage to kind of deal with all of these risks without, killing the impact by making it so uncertain, perhaps, that actually you can't get the bank finance that you need?
Yeah. So I mean, this has been solved in other ways and in more traditional contracting also. As I said, the PPA is the power purchases agreement. And that is sort of you buy, you get a promise from a customer of future purchases of power, and then you can go to the bank and build the wind farm. I mean, that's what the PPA is about, and those has been developing for years. But I mean, that can be quite tough, and there are some pretty big wind farms in Sweden that has gone into bankruptcy due to sort of mistakes made in those contracts, etc. I'm afraid I'm a bit predictable here, but my solution is, again, the relational contract, but in a bit different way, right? Because the common way of doing this today in many cases is that you start by writing an NDA, let's have a discussion, Sarah, etc. And then if we like each other, we move to the next stage and maybe do some product development, and then we enter the next stage, and there's new contracts all the time. So there's this renegotiations, etc. And you might be representing a big company, so then you get the career move, and everything falls apart because no one comes in. So what I typically do is I advise my clients to now enter into long-term sort of one contract within which you develop this relationship. Of course, it should be an NDA included there. But then you have a joint plan, and you have, again, same thing with those guiding principles and shared goals and objectives, etc. And then you sort of narrow it down eventually, and then eventually you come to this commercial tough. I mean, can be tough, not necessarily sort of tough negotiations, but quite hard intellectually to how shall we nail this. But then you are really having worked together for, it can be years actually, or at least months, based on this in this aura of fairness or mentality of fairness, etc. Then you're really in a good position actually to find good also and flexible models there. So that is one how I try to solve it for my clients, but there are other ways.
Yeah, because
quite engaging, of course, to do sort of for impact reasons.
I suppose the other option, which is often entered into, is that if you want flexibility, you kind of give it to one party to decide, which then really skews the contractual balance. And, I've definitely dealt with quite a few disputes that arise in those circumstances, because you do have that kind of unfairness within it. So I can certainly see how relational contracting would work really well in that scenario.
Okay, so let's move on. I mean, that's another. I mean, it's basically just an ordinary customer agreement. Yes, it's not ordinary at all. But I mean, let's look upward in the value chain. We can talk about sort of manufacturing contracts instead. What can we say about that? I know that you have done some work there.
Yeah, so I think again, this is one where you're kind of entering into a contract. Here, maybe it's not a contract that you necessarily think that there is going to be a particular impact goal for. It might just be a general, manufacturing contract. But it might also be that the buyer in particular, or maybe the supplier as well, has their own impact objectives, maybe because they're a purpose-driven corporation, for example, that really want to drive improvements throughout their supply chain. There's one particular example of this that Watson Farley worked on with Fairphone, which is a Dutch company, which, as it says on the tin, aims to make a fair phone. Or it wouldn't be so catchy, but I think that a better name might be Fairer Phone, because we know that there's quite a lot of issues to deal with there, and that they don't shy away from that. But essentially, we worked with them to create an open source model contract for parties to manufacturing agreements, which essentially allows a buyer to, in essence, top up wages of factory workers to a living wage level in respect of the product.
With the manufacturer also further up the value stream, or only one tier, or?
So this particular one is tier one. Oh. I think it could be adapted for other scenarios.
Yeah, interesting.
But given that this was quite a common scenario, this is what we wanted to do. And in particular in the manufacturing context, because as an organization, unless you're absolutely massive, you may well not be the only organization that is sourcing from a particular factory. And ultimately, no matter how much you might want those impact outcomes for the workers at the factory, you don't necessarily have the means to top up living wages for everyone else who is sourcing from that factory as well.
And is this something that the manufacturer is interested in doing? What's in it for them?
Yeah, so essentially the way that it works is that amount is worked out for what this kind of top-up amount would be. The workers who would receive it are consulted with to work out how they want to use it. So there's a couple of examples, one in which the workers decided to split the payment equally, another in which the workers decided that actually they wanted all the money to go to the lowest paid, so that they'd have a really incremental improvement in their working conditions. And having that kind of extra incentive should mean, all other things being equal, and that there is more of an incentive for those workers to stay at that particular factory, and that they know that they're valued. And also for the manufacturer itself, having that kind of relationship and agreeing to do that in order to come with the buyer's wishes means the buyer's more willing to contract with them again. And sometimes buyers will enter into a much longer term supply agreement, for example, with that manufacturer because they've done this. So hopefully it's a win-win-win.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. Also in a world where talent, I mean, this may sometimes be sort of low qualified work, but in many areas, sort of there's a lack of talent for high, and this can be really, I mean, that could be an important thing as well to deal with.
Great.
That's
Well,
really
I think
interesting.
we're nearly coming across
Yeah,
time now, David. Thanks so much for sharing
yeah,
your
thank
thoughts
you.
and
Very
your
interesting.
examples. Any final thoughts to leave us with?
No, I don't think so. I hope that you found this valuable, and I know, yeah, thanks World CC for letting us do this. I know World CC is doing great work, and hopefully someone will want to join Gale and explore what we are doing, right? What do you say, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a privilege, I think, to be a lawyer at this time where we have the opportunity to really innovate and really push the dial. And I think that's why Gale's such a great organization. I mean, we would say that, given that we're on the UK and regional boards respectively. But we'd love more people to come and join the conversation with us.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.